Never thought I'd see the day when a woman would laugh at a man's cancer treatment, but that's exactly what happened when HOA Karen spotted the temporary tent my doctor recommended I use while recovering from chemotherapy. If you've got your own HOA horror stories, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you dealt with the neighborhood dictators in your area. It all started last spring when I was diagnosed with colon cancer. After surgery and beginning chemo, my oncologist suggested I get some fresh air daily, but warned me about sun exposure. My wife, bless her heart, found this special UV-protected tent that could be set up in our backyard. It wasn't much to look at, just a simple 10x12 foot screened enclosure, but it allowed me to sit outside without risking severe burns from my treatments. We'd lived in Willow Lake Estates for 15 years without a single violation. Our lawn was always mowed, our house painted within the approved color scheme, and our holiday decorations never went up a day before Thanksgiving or stayed past New Year's. We were model citizens. That all changed 3 days after we set up the medical tent. I was sitting inside, reading a book and trying to keep some food down, when I noticed a woman standing at the edge of my property line. She had that look, the one that says, "I'm in charge and you're not." I'd seen her at HOA meetings but never interacted. Most folks called her Karen, though her real name was something else. "The hell is that thing?" she called out, pointing at my tent. I explained it was for my medical treatment, that my doctor had recommended it. She didn't even let me finish. "That structure is not approved by the architectural committee. You have 48 hours to remove it." I tried to reason with her. "Mom, I'm recovering from cancer surgery. This is temporary, just until I finish my treatments." She actually laughed. Not a chuckle, but a full-on belly laugh. "I don't care if you're on your deathbed. Rules are rules. Take it down or face the consequences." You wouldn't believe what she did next. She marched right up to my tent, took pictures with her phone, and then stormed off without another word. 2 days later, we received a certified letter from the HOA. It wasn't just a warning. It was a fine for $500, with additional $100 daily. Fines until the unauthorized structure was removed. My wife called the HOA president, a reasonable fellow named Jim, who'd been our neighbor for years. He promised to look into it and call us back. That call never came. Instead, the next day, Karen showed up with 2 other board members. They didn't knock. They just walked into our backyard while I was resting in the tent. "This is your final notice," Karen announced, slapping another violation notice on the tent pole. "You have 24 hours before we begin levying fines." I stood up, feeling dizzy but determined. "I've spoken to Jim. He's looking into an exception for medical necessities." Karen smirked. "Jim's no longer president. I am, and I don't make exceptions." That's when I knew we were in for a fight. Over the next 2 weeks, the fines mounted. $500 turned into $2,500. They threatened to place a lien on our house. The stress was making my recovery harder. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My wife was beside herself with worry. Then came the false hope. Jim called to tell me he'd managed to get the board to agree to a 30-day temporary exemption while I appealed to the architectural committee. I was relieved, thinking maybe common sense had prevailed. We should have known better. A week later, Karen called an emergency board meeting without notifying us and revoked the exemption. Not only that, but she doubled the daily fines to $200 and added a $1,000 administrative fee for the appeal process. When this HOA sounds unbelievable already, make sure to hit subscribe. You don't want to miss how this ends. I was at my wit's end. The stress was literally making me sicker. One afternoon, While sitting in my tent trying to get some air, I noticed something across the lake at Karen's house. She had a large pergola attached to her back patio, definitely not an approved structure according to the community guidelines I'd downloaded. Curious, I walked around the neighborhood with my camera, taking pictures of various violations. Karen wasn't the only board member breaking the rules. 2 others had unapproved sheds, and another had painted his house a color that wasn't on the approved palette without permission. But Karen's violations were the most egregious. Besides the pergola, she'd installed an outdoor kitchen with a permanent roof structure, extended her driveway without approval, and had built a small deck at the lake's edge that extended beyond her property line. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. He reviewed my case and the evidence I'd gathered. They've violated their own bylaws and possibly state laws regarding discrimination against those with medical needs, he explained. But what's really interesting is that Karen has been using her position to avoid enforcement against her own property violations. We sent a formal complaint to the HOA board. Citing specific bylaws and state statutes, we requested an immediate halt to all fines against us and demanded they enforce the rules equally against all board members. Karen's response was swift and vicious. She called an emergency meeting and tried to have us fined for harassment of board members. When that didn't pass, she personally delivered a letter threatening legal action if we didn't cease our campaign of intimidation. That's when my lawyer filed a formal complaint with the state's HOA Ombudsman Office and requested copies of all meeting minutes, architectural committee decisions, and enforcement actions for the past 5 years. The response was shocking. Karen had been selectively enforcing rules for years, fining some residents while ignoring violations by herself and her friends on the board. She'd even used HOA funds to pay for improvements to her own property under the guise of community enhancements. Armed with this evidence, we called a special meeting of the full community membership. The turnout was unprecedented. Nearly every homeowner in Willow Lake Estates packed into the community center. I stood up to speak, feeling weak but determined. I explained my situation, showed pictures of my medical tent, and detailed how Karen had mocked my illness while enriching herself through her position. Then I presented the evidence of her own property violations and the financial documents showing misuse of HOA funds. The room was silent as I finished speaking. Then an older gentleman in the back stood up. "I've lived here since this community was founded," he said. "We created these rules to maintain property values, not to bully people who are fighting for their lives. This woman has to go." The vote was unanimous. Karen was removed from the board immediately, and a special committee was formed to review all her actions as president. But that wasn't the end of it. The state investigation revealed Karen had embezzled over $20,000 in HOA funds over 3 years. She'd used the money for personal expenses, including landscaping at her home and upgrades to her pergola and outdoor kitchen. The new board filed criminal charges. More importantly, they levied fines against her for each of her property violations, totaling over $45,000. When Karen couldn't pay, the HOA placed a lien on her house. She tried to fight it in court, but the evidence was overwhelming. 6 months after she laughed at my cancer treatment tent, Karen was forced to sell her home to pay the fines and legal fees. I wish I could say I felt triumphant watching the moving van pull up to her house, but honestly, I just felt sad. Sad that someone could be so cruel, so lacking in basic human decency that they would torment a cancer patient rather than show a little compassion. The new board immediately approved my medical tent with a formal exemption for medical necessities. They even created a new policy to ensure no one else would ever have to go through what I did. These days, I sit in my tent most afternoons, reading and watching the birds at the lake. Sometimes neighbors stop by to chat. We've become closer than ever through this experience, united against the kind of petty tyranny that nearly destroyed our community. Karen moved to a condo development with no HOA. I heard through the grapevine that she tried to get on their board, but someone recognized her name from the news. You know, they say, what goes around comes around. I've seen it happen time and again in my 65 years, but never has it been as satisfying or as just as watching karma come for the woman who laughed at a man's cancer treatment tent. Life's too short for that kind of nonsense, especially when you're fighting for every single day.